Indigenous Sexual Futures is produced by the Peace Center for Indigenous STBBI Research on the ancestral lands of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon wampum. We acknowledge the ancestors of this territory, and we also acknowledge the lands and territories of all our guests.
Asana, Kikawano, ta. Asana, Kikawano, ta. Asana, Kikawano, ta.
Decolonizing sex.
You are listening to Indigenous Sexual Futures, a podcast storytelling series that is produced by the Peace Center for Indigenous STBBI Research. And yes, you heard the word sexual, STBBIs, and research in my first sentence. Hope that caught your attention. But you also heard the word feast, which is what we hope to do with all of you through this podcast storytelling series. You should also know that we are aligning this podcast series with a growing body of work by scholars, artists, writers, and community in Indigenous Futurisms. You will have to listen to our series to learn more about what Indigenous Futurisms is and why we dropped the word sexual into the middle of Indigenous Futurisms. Stay with us. Now let's get started. En dwe magen na duk. Kwan dagas it Anishinaabe. Wawashkesh na dodem. Anishinaabe and Dao. Hello and welcome to the first episode of Indigenous Sexual Futures. My name is Doris Peltier. I am Anishinaabe and your host for this podcast storytelling series. We are super excited to be launching this first episode, and we have two very special guests that have been invited to set the Indigenous Sexual Futures table for us. But before I introduce our guest, let's get ourselves ready by invoking through song the spirit of the feast. I invited Catherine Martin to offer up a song for us. It is a traditional Mi'kmaq chant called Gwan No De. She tells us that this chant is sung at Mi'kmaq gatherings or at feast. It's a beautiful way to start our virtual feast with all of you. Catherine is also one of our elders at the Feast Center. Let's listen.
Gwan no de, gwan no de, gwan no de, gwan no dan hahi. Gwan alia, gwan no dan hahi. Gwan alia, gwan no dan hahi. Gwan alia, gwan no de. Gwan alia, gwan no de. Gwan alia, gwan no da. Hey, ego, igande. Ego, igana. Gwan alia, gwan no danahi. Gwan alia, gwan no danahi. Gwan alia, gwan no de. Gwan alia, gwan no de. Gwan alia, gwan no da. Deyoka, 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 deyoka. Guanalia guanoranahi. Guanalia guanoranahi. Guanalia guanore. Guanalia guanode. Guanalia guanoda. Hey, hey, no. Daho.
Wilaliok to the ancestors from the east for such a beautiful chant, and Welalin to Catherine. Now, how is Indigenous Futurisms integral to Indigenous Sexual Futures? That is the question. When we first considered Indigenous Futurisms as foundational to the work we do at the Peace Center moving forward, it was also about recognizing that the Indigenous research community has now embedded strengths-based approaches and Indigenous ways of knowing and being in how we conduct research. We have come a long way, but we still have a way to go in resisting colonial settler sexual discourses that introduce sexual taboo and stigma. There is a need to continually add to our toolbox for the next 7 generations. And Indigenous Futurisms is a key building block that we say needs to be added. Finally, we welcome our 2 guests to the Indigenous Sexual Futures table. Our guests today are 2 Anishinaabe scholars. Grace Dillion is a professor in Indigenous Nation Studies at Portland State University and is a key figure in contemporary conversations about Indigenous Futurisms. She also edited Walking the Clouds, an anthology of Indigenous science fiction. Joining her is Randy Jackson, associate professor at the School of Social Work with a cross appointment in the Department of Health, Aging and Society at McMaster University. He is also the nominated principal investigator for the Peace Center. If you want to find out more about Grace and Randy, you can go to the Peace Center website and click on the podcast tab. To set the table, I asked them both to tell us something about themselves when we began the storytelling portion on this podcast. Something that connected them to their lands. Let's listen.
Yes, there are so many stories to tell, but I was very fortunate to be in a family of 9 of us, and we were Anishinaabe, Métis, and just teeny tiny bit of Irish. But with many, many generations of Anishinaabe going back to way, way back to time immemorial, as we would say. I've been very fortunate also to grow up in a family and tribal nation communities where there was a real openness to terms that we now use that were not used when I was little, because I'm a Nokomis, a grandma. Things like gender fluid, which I realized as that word or term came into being that I have always been that way myself. My daughter as well, Beth Lopense, who does Indigenous video games, Anishinaabe in particular, and comic graphic novels. She too is gender fluid. And we have many Indigenous trans folks in my family. Nephew, grandson, many cousins, aunties, uncles. I love the story of Auntie Dave that is told by Cherie Demoline. And I love the slight touches of Auntie Dave lifting his dress to go over part of a bush or the wood. And with those very slight moments, finding that out. And as we grew up very much in the woods and with Bay Mills Nation, and then on the other side, Garden River Nation. I was very fortunate to grow up in a pacifist anarchist community, which was Native founded. my dad among them. And we were very interested in Kajogan, love today, tomorrow, and forever. And that's the harmony that we held in our hearts and invited other peoples of other nations, along with our tribal nations, to join us and speak and think and talk and feast. Many, many moments of feasting.
Amazing. I think that's what we're doing here. We are feasting, and we'll find out what's at the table while we feast. We may discover some special dishes while we sit here together and talk about the important things that we need to talk about. So I'm going to invite our other guests, Randy, to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I grew up in a Chippewa community, and I later started calling it Anishinaabe because that just seemed much more easy and natural to me. It seemed to fit a lot better. I grew up in a family where I had three sisters and my mother and father, and we had a one-bedroom house that we all lived in, and my dad sort of expanded it over the years, adding one room at a time as the family grew. And it wasn't until I started doing my PhD work and I started sort of diving in deeper into what is Indigenous knowledge that I started to remember all the teachings my father had given me. He really was, I think, instrumental in passing a lot of that knowledge on to me. So we grew up, I think, fairly traditionally in the sense of our food. Was a very traditional diet I had. It wasn't until I left the reserve at 16 that I started eating food that was sort of outside my culture. But I grew up, fishing and hunting with my father and him teaching me all that. And my uncles as well were part of that process. I was telling Doris this morning, I remember him waking me up at like 3 a.m. to go check the rabbit snares that were out behind the house in the bush. And, teaching me how to be in the bush alone kind of a thing, right? And I think the biggest lesson he gave me was this idea that the water, because I grew up on Lake Huron, not far from Toronto where I live now, but I grew up there, and the water was centrally important to us as a people. And my dad taught me how to respect the water and how to be in relationship with that water. And it was those earlier lessons, I think, that sort of grounded me in relationships with everybody else that I was in relationships with. That relationship, that first relationship I had, that he put me in relationship to, and with the land and the water that was in front of our house. It's really, really quite beautiful.
When we approached you, Grace, to be the first guest of the Indigenous Sexual Futures, I didn't quite know how to reach out to you. And I thought, I bet you she gets a lot of like cold calls from people, lots of requests, and my email will probably be amongst a pile of 200 emails. And so I wonder how I'm going to craft this request to Grace Dillion, because we've been reading a lot of your stuff and studying a lot of your work. And so I thought, okay, she's Anishinaabe, and I noticed where you were from, and I've been to those communities. And I thought, okay, I'm going to write to her as a Anishinaabe, from one Anishinaabe to another. And I don't know if that's what caught your attention when I wrote from one Anishinaabe kwe to another. That's how I started my email to you.
I loved it. That immediately caught my attention.
Did it?
Yes, that was just a yes, no matter what it was going to be.
Yeah, so we're so excited to have you here, Grace, with us. And Randy was the one that actually turned us all on to Indigenous Futurisms. So maybe we should start talking about that. I'd like to ask you, Grace, what is Indigenous Futurisms? I might know a little bit, and both Randy and I might know some. We've been reading, but our listeners might not know.
Indigenous Futurisms, and now I would add in Futurities from the digital with Jason Lewis and others in Concordia, Montreal, where so much Indigenous digital work is done, and even Futures. at Macquarie University, the Center for Global Indigenous Futures indicates a similar kind of thing. The reason why I called it futurisms is because Afrofuturism had been invented as a term, but honestly, it was a white man who did it. And so I wasn't so into, he's into cyberpunk, Mark Deary, so I wasn't so interested in that. But when Alondra Nelson, as an African American scholar, and now working in the Biden administration, in fact, with genetics, she has a famous book on genetics as well. When she edited a special edition about Afrofuturism, and they were all Black skull activists that were involved in it, and they were writing from their own standpoint, it just blew my mind. It was in a social text journal, and there were many articles, and I can certainly give that link for anyone to read. And I thought, hey, wait a minute. We don't just have Afrofuturism, we have Indigenous Futurisms. And I like the S on it because it pushes and amplifies our tribal nation sovereignty. Since we had to fight for 30 years, 3 decades in the UN to get that S on the end of peoples, that was a huge, contentious debate, because that meant that then if your tribal nation, Indigenous tribal nation, went into what were supposedly other countries or nations, then it would become very problematic, right? That's what they were concerned about, because that's true sovereignty. You can cross any kind of imaginary border that's been created by other nations who want to swallow you up.
Mm-hmm.
And act as, very negligent foster parents. Yes.
Yeah. So I'll ask Randy the same question, but maybe because you turned me on to Indigenous Futurisms, Randy, and to Grace's work and to other scholars out there that are doing this amazing work. What was it about Indigenous Futurisms that really got your groove?
We have this thing called the Feast Center for Indigenous STBBI Research, and we have sort of 3 methodological approaches that we're using to help guide us. And community-based research. We use decolonizing and Indigenous methodologies. But more importantly, out of all of that, there was this strength-based perspective that we wanted to bring our work. I was getting very, very tired of, and Doris and I have been talking about this, I think, for the last 15 years or more, right? Mm-hmm. About this idea that scholars tend to pathologize Indigenous peoples. And in fact, it started to become, I think, the only thing that they were talking about when they talked about Indigenous peoples. What was wrong with us? And I really wanted to stop that. I really wanted to do something a bit differently. And so when we stumbled across sort of Indigenous Futurisms, it really spoke to me in a very deep way, because instead of it being about our trauma, it became about how we use our cultures continuing in the present and into the future. And that's where I think we need to focus. I don't think we need to focus, or I don't anymore. I don't need to do that anymore. I don't need to do that kind of research where we pathologize. I really want to focus on sort of the spiritual and cultural pathways that Indigenous people use to promote well-being and health in their own lives. And how do we develop programs and services that support that development? And this was something that really came very strongly to me when I was doing research with the Two-Spirit people of the First Nation here in Toronto, Ontario. We did a study on resilience and the resilience of Two-Spirit men living with HIV. We called it Two Shoals. And it was in that study that the idea of strengths became much more focused And the idea of resilience was something that got troubled in or problematized in that research, because when we were doing our member checking back, I mean, a guy in the audience stood up and he said, you know what, I never wanted to be resilient in the first place. And I'm thinking, right on, right? Absolutely, you know, of course not. And it was that one comment from that one person and that one member checking that sort of propelled me forward into this. Let's look for strengths that are not resilient, but are strengths that are grounded in our cultures. And that to me was much more valuable work than supporting somebody to be resilient in the context of continuing colonization. So that's why we started doing work in this area. And that's why your ideas around Indigenous Futurisms became very, very important to us, because we wanted to learn more about that. We wanted to design our research center, which is teaching scholars across the 4 pillars of health how to use Indigenous knowledge in their STBBI research. And when I say STBBI, I mean sexually transmitted bloodborne infections. And so that's sort of where I land with that.
I really like the usage of Anishinaabe words and concepts, you know, that worldview that you use to kind of elevate Indigenous futurisms, you know, and lift it up, particularly that word biskaabiiyang.
Mm.
When I was first reading, I thought biskaabiiyang, I had to think about it. And I thought about it and I thought, I get it. That's a stanmanda. So I got it, but it took a while for me. I had to reflect on it. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, you know, that piece, you know, so people aren't just kind of thinking, oh, they're just about the future, when the future is important.
Yeah, that is actually what makes Afrofuturism, African futurisms, Indigenous futurisms, Latinx futurisms, LBGTQAI 2 Spirit Plus futurisms, and even in many cases, Asian futurisms and Gulf futurisms. And that is that we stand out as revolutionary and radical because we're not debating the binary of mind versus body, which is kind of the essence and the manifesto of cyberpunk and near future kind of scenarios. So for us, it's body, mind, and spirit. And that's why I got so excited, Randy, when you mentioned that, because I thought, oh, yeah. And that stands out as very radical and revolutionary. And then what that means is, well, there's one book here called Indigenous Futurisms Transcending Past, Present, Future, because that's the way we live. We walk with our ancestors, even as we pray to them. We see and learn from our ancestors, and they walk with us. We have native slipstream kind of moments where we
Yes.
in and out and in between. And so I've started to say, instead of trying to provide this is Indigenous Futurisms, because really it's the creatives that are creating and experimenting and just coming up with so many wonderful aspects of it. And I have to say that indigiqueer futurisms is very, very strong now and is often connected to also our global weirding and climate refugees, largely Black and Brown peoples globally around the world that are being impacted. And I don't know that they're always dipping into queer ecology necessarily, which is an actual strand of biology that's very fascinating. But because we view animal nations, plant nations, and phenomenological peoples, which would be inclement weather in some cases, like the new pyro fires, that wildfires that are going on in California, where you actually form a new term for it, or where hurricanes are smashing into typhoons and other kinds of things that are just starting to kind of accumulate into phenomenological persons like our Thunderbirds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow,
So that's
that's
just a part of it. So I think John Reeder said this the best. It's not a genre, it's a family that grows and extends with semblances or resemblances. And what you start seeing as you bring them together and read them, at this point, I think I have 2 bookcases full of just Indigenous Futurisms, collections, books, novels, comics, and then films are elsewhere. But there's a lot out there, a lot.
wow.
And I'll stop there.
I just read Gregory Smithers' new book on
yes.
reclaiming Two-Spirit, and he has a chapter in there on futures, and he starts to map sort of all the things that are happening out in the world where Two-Spirit people and communities of Two-Spirit people are starting to, all the things that they're doing in terms of sort of living in their cultures in the present. So in other words, what he's saying is healing is happening now. The future's happening now, right? And we can grow this. We can grow this and push it forward. And I just love that idea. I love the idea that we can sort of, how should I say that? How we can sort of have this different vision of who Indigenous people are and how we can draw on our cultures, our strengths, our abilities to do that kind of work that's already occurring out there, right? It's really, really fascinating for me that that can happen in a context where I think the West often is invested in pathologizing us because it allows them, when they pathologize us, to continue to colonize us, right? We're sick, we're disorganized, we have all these, I don't know how to say that, but it's sort of like, if you're sick and disorganized, then I must step in to help you. It sort of gives them justification for that. And I think that Indigenous Futurism sort of says back to that, well, you know what? We are strong. We have a history of being strong. We're here today. I mean, we're recording this podcast on Orange T-shirt Day, or Truth and Reconciliation Day here in Canada. And it's fascinating that we've survived all of that, and we're here today, and we're strong, and we're creating futures for ourselves that are grounded in our cultures, that draw on our traditional teachings, and et cetera, and to create new programs that sort of talk about that rather than talk about our pathologies.
So I want to ask the two of you to speak to how Indigenous Futurisms, you said this yourself, Grace, and we kind of picked up on it, that Indigenous Futurisms is integral to Indigenous Sexual Futures. What did you mean by that? And maybe Randy could respond to that as well.
Well, it's interesting because I always go with the exciting stuff that is out there. And this is a graphic novel called Surviving the City, Volume 2, From the Roots Up. And all of this information I can give to put with the podcast. But Tasha Spillett, she, her, hers, she's Innu and Trinidadian. And then there's Natasha Donovan, who's Métis and is the illustrator of this. And what is so beautiful about this book to me is this is made for anyone, actually, but it's told as a story of younger ones that want to find out about Two-Spirit. And it's now the only glitch for me in this story is that it's a Anishinaabe community, and there's Nish Elder who is very stridently against Two-Spirit or LGBTQAI Two-Spirit plus. And so what happens is a Cree elder is brought in and tells the Two-Spirit what the Two-Spirit in the Nijmanadug Two-Spirit, I'm saying it in our language again, but not Cree. But I find this a very fascinating one since from my own family experience. So we all have different experiences. You know, I grew up as Nish, Ojibwe, Chippewa, and we were very, very welcoming of Two Spirit. My sister Faith, who has walked on and was younger than me and died way too young, was Two Spirit and Mishkiki. And the Indigenous Futurisms, speaking of pathologizing, what I've noticed as a process quite often is there will be an awakening, especially in YA literature, and there's a lot of it for Indigenous Futurisms, preparing our young ones, our little ones. And can I get away with, because you know, Joy Harjo and others were thinking of skin thinking, and then that was picked up for indigiqueer peoples and Two Spirit peoples. And this is a friend of mine that I love dearly and met long, long ago, Rain Prudhomme Cranford. And I will just read very quickly what she says. These three poems are as much about the body of our homelands as the bodies of ourselves, which already Randy and you, Doris, were talking about in terms of Aki land, Nibi water, and how that's integral, right, to our own bodies and the way we treat our own bodies. Our lovers and Gulf South Indigenous, post-contact Indigenous peoples. These lands are Atakpa Ishuk, Louisiana Creole, Choctaw, Tunica Biloxi, Homa, Chitimata, Creek, Latinidad Mestizos, and many other tribes and communities. Folks whose culture and memory are intimately tied to the humid waters of our birth, like the southern Gulf spaces we call home, from Florida to Louisiana and even Oklahoma. We know the power in the wind and water, from the fury of hurricanes, where the center of peace lurks in the eye of the storm, to the swirling winds of thunder beings as they twirl counterclockwise across the red Calcasieu Canadian and Oklahoma rivers into the low plains. Love is sensual, empowering, devastating, graceful, and as resistant as the lands and ancestors we call home.
Wow.
And I don't know if it would be okay to read just one of her poems.
Sure.
Give that kind of sense. Okay, so I'll go with Salt Lick.
Salt Lick? Okay.
Uh-huh. They say some of our people fell from sky, others crept from inside earth, and still others came crawling up from beneath the waves of the Gulf onto shores they rose like alligator people. This was our emergence narrative. How naturally you coax the waters from inside me, easy falling rain from the ducts of my eyes, slithering tongue, proboscis spreading nectar on lips, fluid slipping greedily from the crease of my thighs. In pleasure and pain, you pull waters from me, heavy and thick with salt, licked and dried. I wonder if there was any pun intended when you told me your people were fishermen, oystermen, because you shock me so very well, with hard-worn fingers practiced in the art, sucking briny fluids from mother of pearl shells. Locate my pearl every time. You are the salt and bone of home. Your touch, taste, a thrall, draws me into old wire crab traps, locks me down to wait for you. The knuckles of your hand scraping my flesh creates a call and response, leaping from your blood into mine. It shuffle steps a Gulf breeze rhythm older than this myth called time. This wind carries voices singing mimetic cries of fishing streams and humid, thick rain. We move with the fury of a hurricane until limbs weep like Spanish moss, then fluttering ripples. till again you coax the tides in me to rise. As you swirl away, leave me in the devastation.
Oh, that is a powerful poem and very um, sensual, and it's niche eroticism.
Yes. And this is in Beth's Relational Constellations, Sovereign Traces, Volume 2, graphic novel collection.
Wow, wow, that's really powerful. Is most of her writing? Does she write eroticism? That's connected.
Oh, Rain does, along with Indigenous Futurism, but there's always just a loving sensuality, I would call it, that runs through her wording at all times.
Mm-hmm.
And she is a beautiful, beautiful person.
Wow, thank you for sharing that, Miigwech. Yeah,
Sure.
Randy.
Yes, Doris.
When we think about Indigenous sexual futures, it's expansive, right?
Yeah.
Sexuality is expansive.
Yeah.
Like, we don't necessarily have to be talking about the disease or be explicit in terms of talking about sex.
Yeah.
It's very expansive. Like, we could talk about gender, we could talk about the poetry, eroticism, pleasure, so many things.
Yeah.
What's the expansiveness of how you see it when you think about it?
Well, you know, with the Feast Center, where culture and healing is something that's centrally important to the work that we do. And I shared that story about my father and him putting me in relationship to the land, and how those teachings that he gave me about how to be in relationship to the water that was in front of the house that I grew up in was something that could be translated and applied in other areas of my life, including, you know, healthy sexuality, healthy sexual relationships. And as I recover that knowledge, right, because it's sort of buried somewhere still, right, it starts to speak to me about how sexuality and future is really about the connection we have with the land, and how we need to put ourselves back in relationship with the land if we're not there already, and live our sexualities in that kind of a way. For me, sexuality and its connection to the land are really, really important, right? It sort of wants me to get involved in sort of land back movements kind of a thing, right? It's a really sort of an expansive kind of approach to thinking about sexuality. It allows us to talk about colonization and what it's done to us. But more importantly, it allows for this conversation about tradition and how we can use those now and in the future moving forward.
Jimmy Gwetch to our two guests, Grace Dillion and Randy Jackson. Now, as we wrap up, I want to share some of my big takeaways from our two guests. The biggest one for me is the usage of the Anishinaabe word biskaabiiyang. This is an Anishinaabe concept of returning to ourselves, and is now widely used as a replacement word for decolonizing in the tremendously important work within Indigenous Futurisms. As a fluent Anishinaabe speaker, I quite like that. It has a deep resonance for me, and I hope it resonates for all of you listeners too. Another takeaway is on how important it is for us to move away from pathologizing Indigenous people when we do research. Rather, we need to look for strengths that are not about resilient, but are strengths that are grounded in our cultures. For me, this pushes back against the overusage of resilience as the fallback or conclusion when it comes to Indigenous people. I have an Anishinaabe word that replaces the overusage of the word resilience, but that is for another podcast. Grace also acknowledged the many creators that are creating and coming up with so many wonderful aspects of Indigenous Futurisms. She no longer has to say, this is Indigenous Futurisms, with one definition, I suppose. By saying this, we at the Peace Center, along with many of you who are involved in STBBI research or in delivery of programs, you too can also be creators that build on Indigenous sexual futures. This is quite exciting moving forward. We will continue exploring this through this podcast. We need to wrap up this baby now. I hope that you enjoyed our podcast. To be quite honest, I had some anxiety in producing this first podcast. Podcasting is storytelling, and I just have to keep reminding myself that I am a storyteller. We, in fact, are all storytellers. Research, too, is storytelling. In closing, we would like to acknowledge our funders, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, for making yet another aspect of the Peace Center possible. Thank you for tuning in. This is Doris Peltier, your host, signing off. Vama pimenoa taganondeme miigwech.
There's so much healing that needs to take place. And we, as Anishinaabe people, have these sacred items that Creator left us that we can share with the world in our healing journey for ourselves and everybody else that walks with us equally.
Are you ready?
Sana.